The glass in my hand was still full when she turned around and asked me the question that would change everything. "Why do you gaze at my back, human?" Her voice cut through the noise of the reception hall like a blade through silk. Every conversation around us stopped. I felt dozens of eyes, human and alien, land on me at once. I did not even have time to set my drink down before the alien officer, tall and pale blue, with a long ridge of segmented plates running down her spine, stepped closer and repeated herself, louder this time. "Answer me. Why do you gaze at my back?" Her name was Kalith Vren, a senior officer of the Threnai delegation, the alien species we had been sharing this research station with for the past 6 months. I knew her rank. I knew her reputation. What I did not know, until that exact moment, was that among her people, the back was the most sacred and most vulnerable part of the body. To stare at it without permission was not rude. It was an accusation. It meant you saw them as prey. I had not meant anything like that. I had simply been standing near the edge of the room, quietly watching the crowd the way I always did, and my eyes had drifted to her because she was standing alone near an open corridor, her back turned to a doorway that led into an unlit maintenance section. It was instinct, nothing more. But instinct does not translate well across species, and I was about to learn that the hard way. "I was not staring at anything," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was pounding. "I was just standing here." "Your eyes were fixed on my spine for 11 seconds, she said. I counted. "Humans do not look at nothing for 11 seconds. A murmur rippled through the room. One of the human diplomats near me, a woman named Grace Hollins, gave me a look that told me I needed to fix this quickly, before it became something official. The Threnai delegation was famously proud, famously formal, and famously quick to treat small insults as large ones. "I meant no disrespect," I said. "Where I come from, watching someone's back is not an insult. It is the opposite." Kalith's eyes narrowed. Her people had 4 eyelids, and when she was angry, all 4 moved at once, giving her stare a strange, layered intensity that made my skin prickle. "Explain," she said. "Now." I opened my mouth, but nothing useful came out. "How do you explain, in 10 seconds, in front of an entire room, something that is not even a conscious thought for most humans? How do you explain that soldiers whisper, 'I've got your 6,' to each other before walking into danger, and that the phrase means, 'I am watching the direction you cannot see'? How do you explain that a mother will stand with her back to a doorway so her child does not have to? How do you explain that this is not weakness, and it is not an insult, it is one of the oldest forms of care we have?" I did not have the words ready, and in the silence that followed, Kalith's expression hardened into something I recognized immediately, even across species. It was the look of someone who has just decided they were right about you all along. "You have nothing to say," she said. "That is answer enough." She turned and walked away, her escort of 2 younger Threnai officers falling in step behind her, and I stood there holding a warm, forgotten drink, feeling the entire room's attention slide off me like water off glass, leaving behind only a cold, uncomfortable silence. Grace appeared at my side a moment later, her voice low. "That was not good, Daniel," she said. "I know. You do understand what you just did, right? To them, that is not a small thing. Among the Threnai, watching someone's exposed back without invitation is considered an act of aggression. There are records of it starting actual conflicts between their own clans." "I was not being aggressive," I said. "I do not even know how to explain what I was doing." "Then you had better figure it out," Grace said, glancing toward the corridor where Kalith had disappeared. "Because I just watched Commander Vren walk toward the station director's office, and I would bet every credit I own that she is filing a formal complaint against you right now." She was right. By the time I made it back to my quarters that night, there was already a message waiting for me from the station director, a tired-looking man named Edmund Castellon, requesting my presence at a review hearing the next morning. The message did not use soft language. It used words like formal complaint and diplomatic incident and possible reassignment. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time after reading it, staring at the wall, trying to understand how 11 seconds of instinct had turned into something that could end my posting on this station, maybe even end my career. I thought back over every human relationship I had ever had. My father, a quiet man who used to stand near the door at family gatherings, always angled slightly so he could see the whole room. I never asked him why. I never had to. Everyone understood without being told. My older sister, who used to walk on the side of the sidewalk closest to traffic when we were kids, without ever explaining why she did it. My first training instructor, a woman who taught me that in any room, in any unfamiliar place, you find the exits, you find the blind spots, and you never let anyone you care about stand with their back to danger if you can help it. None of that was aggression. None of that was an insult. It was the opposite of both. But how do you make an alien woman who had just met you understand thousands of years of quiet human instinct in the span of a single hearing? I barely slept that night. When morning came, I dressed in my most formal uniform, the one I usually saved for ceremonies, and I walked to the review chamber with a knot in my stomach that refused to loosen no matter how many times I told myself I had done nothing wrong. The chamber was already half full when I arrived. Director Castellan sat at the head of a long table, flanked by 2 human aides. Across from them sat 3 members of the Threnai delegation, including an older, heavily decorated officer I did not recognize, and beside him Calith Vren, sitting perfectly straight, her 4 eyelids blinking in that slow, deliberate rhythm her people used when they were being watched closely and wanted everyone to know it. She did not look at me as I sat down, not once. Director Castellan cleared his throat and opened a small data pad in front of him. "We are here," he said, "to address a complaint filed by Commander Calith Vren of the Threnai delegation regarding a diplomatic incident that occurred last evening. Specifically, an accusation of aggressive staring behavior directed at her by Lieutenant Daniel Ashford." He looked up at me. "Lieutenant, you have the opportunity to respond." I stood, my chair scraping softly against the floor, and for a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what I would say. I looked at Calith. She still would not meet my eyes. "I am not going to pretend I did not do what she says I did," I said. "I was looking at her back. I will not deny that. But I want the chance to explain why, because I do not think anyone in this room, human or Threnai, actually understands what was happening in my head at that moment." The older Threnai officer, whose name I would later learn was Ambassador Threll, folded his hands together and studied me with an expression I could not quite read. "Then explain," he said. "We are listening." And so I did. I told them everything I had thought about the night before, about soldiers and mothers and sisters and quiet instincts passed down without ever needing words. I told them that in human culture, choosing to watch someone's unprotected side is one of the deepest, oldest forms of loyalty we have, so old that most of us do not even notice we are doing it anymore. I told them it was not about seeing someone as weak. It was about choosing, without being asked, without being paid, without any bond of blood or contract, to stand as a shield for someone who has no idea they even need one. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Ambassador Threll spoke, his voice slow and careful. "Among my people," he said, "the back is protected by law, by rank, and by blood bond only. No Threnai would ever place themselves at risk for another without such a bond in place. It would be considered reckless. Foolish even. I understand that is your custom," I said. "It is not mine." Calith finally looked at me then, her 4 eyelids narrowing slightly, though this time the expression felt different from the night before. Less anger, more confusion. "You are saying," she said slowly, "that you looked at my back not because you saw weakness, but because some part of you wished to guard it, without being asked, without any reward." "Yes," I said. "That makes no sense," she said, but there was less certainty in her voice than there had been the night before. Director Castellan looked between the 2 of us, clearly unsure whether the tension in the room had gotten better or worse. "I am not asking you to understand it today," I said, looking directly at Calith now. I am only asking you to believe that it was never meant as an insult. Where I come from, it is the opposite of one." She did not respond. She simply studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before finally turning back to face the director. "I withdraw my request for immediate disciplinary action," she said. "But I do not withdraw my confusion, or my suspicion. It was not forgiveness. It was not even close to forgiveness. But it was enough, for now, to keep me on the station, and enough to end the hearing without my career ending along with it." As the room began to empty, I caught Calith's eye one last time before she turned to leave. There was something new in her expression, something that had not been there the night before. It was not trust, not yet, but it was curiosity, sharp and unwilling, the kind that does not let go easily once it takes hold. I had no idea, as I watched her walk away, that within a matter of days, I would prove everything I had just tried to explain to her, not with words this time, but with my own body standing between her and something that meant her harm. The days after the hearing were strange. Nobody on the station spoke of the incident directly, but I could feel it following me everywhere, in the way certain Threnai officers glanced at me a little too long in the corridors, in the way my own colleagues seemed to choose their words more carefully whenever Calith's name came up. I told myself it would fade. Most diplomatic embarrassments do, eventually, buried under the weight of newer, fresher problems. But 3 days later, I received a message that told me it was not fading at all. It was growing into something much larger than I had expected. The message came from Director Castellan himself, requesting that I attend a joint cultural review session, human and Threnai representatives together, to formally discuss what he called a growing philosophical dispute regarding protective behavior and personal boundaries. When I read that sentence, I actually laughed out loud, alone in my quarters, because it sounded so absurd. A philosophical dispute, over 11 seconds of looking at someone's back. But when I arrived at the session the next morning, I understood immediately that this was not a joke to anyone else in the room. The chamber was larger this time, filled with nearly a dozen people. Human researchers sat on one side, Threnai scholars and officers on the other, and in the middle, seated at opposite ends of a long curved table, were Ambassador Threll and a Threnai scholar I had not met before, an older woman named Sael Doran, who I would soon learn specialized in the study of foreign cultural behavior. Calith sat near the ambassador, arms folded, her posture rigid and formal. She still would not look directly at me when I walked in, though I noticed her eyes tracked my movement across the room in a way that told me she was very aware of exactly where I was standing. Director Castellan opened the session by summarizing what had happened, careful and neutral in his wording, and then turned the floor over to Sael Doran. "I have spent the last 3 days reviewing recordings and reports of the incident," she said, her voice calm and measured. "And I confess, I do not yet understand it. Lieutenant Ashford claims his behavior was an act of care, yet by every standard we understand, watching an unprotected back without consent, without bond, without payment, is the behavior of a predator, or at best, a threat display." "With respect," I said, "I do not think you can measure human behavior using Threnai standards, any more than I could measure Threnai behavior using human ones." "Then help us understand your standards," Sael said. "Truly, I am not here to condemn you, Lieutenant. I am here to learn." I glanced at Calith. She was still not looking at me, but her jaw had tightened slightly, and I got the sense she was listening far more closely than she wanted anyone to notice. "All right," I said. "Let me try to explain it properly this time." I took a slow breath and thought back to every story I had ever heard growing up, every half-remembered lesson passed down without anyone ever calling it a lesson. "Humans are not a strong species, physically," I began. "We do not have claws or armor or venom or any of the natural defenses most predators have. For most of our history, the only real advantage we had was each other. We survived by forming groups, and within those groups, by watching out for one another in ways that had nothing to do with reward or obligation." Sword. "But surely there are rules," Sael said, "structures, hierarchies that dictate who protects whom." There are some, I admitted. In the military, in certain professions, yes, there are structures. But underneath all of that, there is something older and less formal. It is the instinct that makes a stranger step toward a child near danger, without stopping to think about whether that child is theirs. It is the instinct that makes someone rush toward trouble to help a person they only met that same day. It is the instinct that made me stand near an open doorway last week and quietly notice that Commander Vren's back was turned toward it, and feel, without even choosing to feel it, that something in me did not like that. The room was quiet for a moment. Ambassador Threll leaned forward slightly. "You are describing an instinct that requires no bond," he said. "No blood tie, no formal agreement, no payment of any kind." "Yes," I said. "That is—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Inefficient. Dangerous even. Among my people, protection without structure invites disorder. If any Threnai could simply decide, on instinct, to place themselves between another and danger, without earning the right to do so through bond or rank, our entire system of trust would fall apart." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe it is not about a system at all. Maybe it is simply about choosing to care for someone, freely, without needing permission to do it." Kalith finally spoke, her voice quieter than I expected. "You keep using the word freely," she said, "as though choice, without structure, without cost, is something admirable. Among my people, a debt or a bond gives protection its meaning. Without one, it is simply unearned, unexplained, dangerous." "I understand why it feels that way to you," I said, finally meeting her eyes directly. "But to me, it is the opposite. A bond, a debt, a contract. Those things guarantee protection because of obligation. What I am describing guarantees nothing. It asks for nothing. It simply happens because something in you decides another person's safety matters, even if you barely know them, even if you will never be repaid." "That is not logical," she said. "No," I agreed. "It is not. But it has kept my species alive for a very long time." The room fell into a strange, thoughtful silence. Syl Doran was writing something rapidly on her datapad. Ambassador Threll sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable, clearly turning the idea over in his mind like a stone he was not sure whether to keep or set down. Kalith, though, was staring at me now, fully, openly, for the first time since the reception hall, and in her expression I saw something shift, something small but unmistakable, the look of a person encountering an idea so foreign to everything they believed that it left a crack, however tiny, in the wall of their certainty. "You truly believe," she said slowly, "that a person could stand at another's back, with nothing to gain, and mean it as an honor rather than an insult." "I do not believe it," I said. "I know it. I have done it my whole life without even thinking about it. So has almost every human on this station, right now, in ways you have probably never noticed." She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Director Castellon's datapad let out a sharp, insistent chime, cutting through the moment like a blade. He glanced down at it, his expression shifting instantly from calm diplomatic patience to something far more alert. "I am sorry," he said, standing quickly. "We need to pause this session. There has been a security alert in the lower research deck." The room stirred immediately, chairs scraping, voices rising in confusion. I stood as well, old instincts already sharpening my senses, my eyes scanning the exits out of habit before I even fully understood what was happening. "What kind of alert?" Ambassador Threll asked, his voice tight. "Unidentified movement near the auxiliary power core," Castellon said, already moving toward the door. "Security teams are responding now. I need everyone to remain calm and move toward the nearest secure zone." The calm, careful tone of the meeting shattered instantly into something far more urgent. People began moving toward the exits in a controlled but hurried stream, and in the confusion of shifting bodies and raised voices, I found myself only a few steps away from Kalith, who had risen from her chair but seemed, for just a moment, uncertain which direction to move. And that was when I noticed it again, The same instinct from the reception hall, sharper this time, more urgent. She was standing near the open chamber doors, her back angled toward the darkened corridor beyond them, a corridor that led directly toward the lower research deck where the alert had just been triggered. Without thinking, without deciding, without any bond or reward guiding me, I stepped sideways, placing myself between her and that open doorway. She noticed immediately. Her eyes snapped to me, sharp and searching. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice low and tense. "The same thing I was doing 11 seconds worth of, 5 days ago," I said, my eyes fixed on the corridor behind her. "Watching your back." For a moment, she said nothing at all. Then, from somewhere deep in the station, an alarm began to sound, low and insistent, and the lights along the corridor flickered once, twice, before steadying into a dim emergency glow. Whatever was happening in the lower research deck, it was no longer a distant problem. It was moving closer, and I had a feeling, one I could not explain any more than I could explain the instinct that had put me at Calith's back in the first place, that we were about to find out exactly how far that instinct would carry me. The emergency lighting cast everything in a dull red glow as we moved through the corridor, Director Castellan leading the group toward the nearest secure zone. I stayed close to Calith, closer than protocol probably allowed, my eyes constantly sweeping the side passages and shadowed doorways we passed. She noticed. Of course she noticed, but she did not tell me to stop. "Security teams are converging on the lower deck. Now," Castellan called back over his shoulder, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. "Everyone, stay together. Move quickly." We had made it perhaps halfway down the main corridor when the lights above us flickered violently and died completely, plunging the entire passage into darkness broken only by the faint red glow of emergency strips along the floor. A collective gasp rippled through the group. Someone near the back of the line stumbled, and in the confusion, the tight formation we had been keeping broke apart. "Stay calm," Castellan shouted, though his own voice betrayed how far from calm he actually was. "This is likely a power redirect, not a direct threat. Stay together." But I had already stopped listening to reassurances. Every instinct I owned was screaming that something was wrong, badly wrong, and when I turned to check on Calith, I realized with a jolt of alarm that in the chaos of the sudden darkness, she had drifted several steps away from the group, closer to a side corridor that branched off toward the maintenance access shafts. "Calith," I said, my voice low and urgent, using her name without rank for the first time. "Stay close to me." "I am aware of my surroundings," she said, though I could hear the faintest thread of uncertainty beneath her composed tone. That was when I saw it. A shape, low and quick, moving along the floor of the side corridor behind her, barely visible in the dim red light. It was not a security officer. It moved wrong, too low, too fast, hugging the shadows in a way that told me instantly it did not want to be seen. I did not stop to analyze it. I did not stop to ask permission, or consider bonds, or weigh costs and rewards the way Calith's people might have. I simply moved. I stepped fully in front of her, putting my body between her and the side corridor just as the shape surged forward out of the darkness. It was some kind of automated security drone, reprogrammed or hijacked, its usual soft blue running lights replaced with an angry pulsing red, and instead of the harmless scanning beam it should have carried, it was equipped with something far more dangerous, a short-range disruption charge clearly meant to do damage. I threw my arm up on instinct, catching the edge of the drone's chassis as it lunged, knocking its aim wide just as the disruption charge fired. A wave of stinging energy raced across my shoulder and down my arm, sharp and burning, strong enough to knock the breath out of me and send me stumbling sideways into the wall. But it missed Calith entirely. "Daniel!" she shouted, and it was the first time she had ever used my name at all, let alone without my rank attached to it. The drone reoriented itself, its red lights sweeping toward us again, but by then Castellan's shout had drawn the attention of 2 security officers further down the corridor, and their weapons fire lit up the darkness, striking the drone squarely and sending it crashing to the floor in a shower of sparks before it could fire a second time. For a moment nobody moved. The only sound was the faint hum of dying machinery and my own ragged breathing as I pushed myself off the wall, my arm throbbing painfully where the disruption charge had grazed me. Kalith was at my side almost instantly, her hands hovering near my shoulder, uncertain whether to touch the injury or not. "You are hurt," she said, and there was something raw in her voice now, something that had not been there in any of our previous conversations. "I will be fine," I said, though the pain in my arm suggested otherwise. "It only grazed me." "You put yourself in its path," she said, "deliberately. You saw it before I did, and instead of warning me and stepping aside, you placed your own body between myself and the danger." "Yes," I said, wincing as I straightened up. "Why?" she asked, and the question was different this time, no longer sharp with accusation, but genuinely confused, almost desperate for an answer that made sense. "There was no bond between us, no debt, no reward waiting for you if you succeeded. You gained nothing from that action, and you risked everything." Security officers were already moving past us, securing the corridor and inspecting the fallen drone, and Castellan was shouting orders into his communicator, but in that moment, none of it mattered to either of us. It was just the two of us, standing in the dim red emergency light, her question hanging in the air between us like something fragile. "I did not think about bonds or debts or rewards," I said slowly, still catching my breath. "I saw something moving toward your back, and my body moved before my mind even finished deciding what to do. That is the truth. That is all it ever is for humans. We do not calculate it, we just do it." She stared at me for a long moment, her 4 eyelids blinking slowly, and I could see her searching my face for some hidden motive, some explanation that fit neatly into the structures her culture had built around protection and worth and bonds. She did not find one, because there was not one to find. "You would let harm come to yourself," she said quietly, "for a back you do not own." The question landed somewhere deep in my chest, and I realized, standing there with my arm throbbing and adrenaline still burning through my veins, that this was the real question, the one underneath every argument we had had since the reception hall 5 days earlier. "I never thought of it as owning anything," I said. "I do not need to own something to want it safe." She did not answer right away. Instead, she reached out, carefully, almost hesitantly, and rested her hand against the uninjured side of my shoulder, a gesture I did not fully understand, but that felt, somehow, deliberate and significant, as though she were testing the weight of an idea she had never allowed herself to consider before. "Among my people," she said softly, "such an act would require a bond formed over years, a debt repaid through generations, and you did it for a stranger you had known for less than a week, who had accused you of aggression in front of an entire room. Maybe that is exactly why it matters," I said. "Because I gained nothing from it, because there was no bond forcing my hand. I simply chose to." Behind us, the security officers finished sweeping the corridor and confirmed it was clear, and Castellan hurried over, his face pale with worry, asking rapid questions about my injury and what exactly had happened. Kalith stepped back slightly, her hand falling away from my shoulder, but she did not look away from me, not even as medics arrived to examine the burn along my arm, not even as the corridor filled once more with noise and movement and the ordinary chaos of a crisis winding down. She simply watched me, quiet and thoughtful, as though she were seeing something for the first time that had been standing in front of her all along, and had simply been waiting for her to notice it. It was not trust yet. I understood that. Trust for her people was built slowly, deliberately, through bonds that took years to form. But it was something. A crack in the wall had become a doorway, and though neither of us said it aloud in that crowded, chaotic corridor, we both understood that something between us had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The medics kept me in the station's small medical bay for the rest of that evening, treating the burn along my arm with a cool gel that numbed the pain within minutes, though the ache beneath it lingered like a memory refusing to fade. I was told I would need to rest for a day, maybe two, before returning to full duty, and I did not argue. My arm throbbed with every small movement, and the adrenaline that had carried me through the corridor had long since drained away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion I had not expected. I did not think Kalith would come, but she did, quietly, an hour after the medics had finished, slipping into the medical bay without announcement, dismissing her usual escort with a short, firm gesture before pulling a chair beside my bed and sitting down without asking permission. "You should be resting," she said, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. "I am resting," I said. "This counts." A faint sound escaped her, something close to amusement, though I suspected she would never admit to finding humor in anything I said. For a while, neither of us spoke. The medical bay was quiet except for the soft hum of monitoring equipment and the distant sound of the station settling back into its normal rhythm after the earlier chaos. "The drone has been traced," she said eventually. "It belonged to a faction opposed to the treaty negotiations between our peoples. They intended to disrupt the talks by targeting a member of my delegation, myself, specifically." "I am sorry," I said. "That must be difficult to hear." "It is not the first attempt," she said simply. "There have been others, quieter, less direct. I am accustomed to it. It is part of holding rank during uncertain times." "That does not make it easier," I said. She was quiet again for a moment, studying my face with an intensity that made me feel, not uncomfortable exactly, but deeply seen, in a way few people had ever managed before. "I have spent my entire life understanding protection as something earned," she said finally. "My family bonded me to my personal guard through years of shared duty before I ever trusted him with my back. My rank was bonded to the officers beneath me through oaths that took seasons to complete. Every shield I have ever had was built slowly, deliberately, through structures designed specifically to prevent exactly what you did today." "And now?" I asked. "Now I do not know what to think," she admitted, and there was something almost vulnerable in the way she said it, a crack in the composed, formal exterior she had worn since the moment I met her. "You had none of those things. No bond, no oath, no years of shared duty, and yet you placed yourself between myself and danger, without a moment's hesitation, as though it were the simplest decision in the world." "It was," I said. "That is the part I do not think I have explained well enough. It did not feel like a decision at all. It felt like breathing." She leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes drifting toward the ceiling as though searching for something written there that might help her make sense of what I was describing. "Tell me about your father," she said suddenly, catching me off guard. "You mentioned him, during the review session, the one who stood near doorways at gatherings." I smiled faintly, surprised she had remembered such a small detail. "He never explained why he did it," I said. "He would just quietly position himself so he could see the whole room, every time, at every gathering, for as long as I can remember. When I was young, I thought it was strange. It was not until I was older that I understood what he was doing." "What was he doing?" "He was making sure that if anything ever happened, he would see it first," I said. "Not because anyone asked him to, not because he owed anyone a debt. He simply could not help himself. It was who he was." "And you learned this behavior from him," she said, "without him ever teaching it directly." "I think most of us learn it that way," I said. "Nobody sits children down and explains the rules of watching each other's backs. It is absorbed, slowly, through example, through stories, through the small quiet things people do, without ever calling attention to them." Kalith was silent for a long moment, her expression distant, and I got the sense she was turning something over in her mind, testing its weight, trying to fit it into a framework that had never needed to hold such a shape before. "Among my people," she said eventually, "there is a word, tesuvan, which describes a bond so deep it transcends duty, a devotion that exists beyond rank or debt. It is considered the rarest and most honored form of loyalty a Threnai can offer another. It typically takes an entire lifetime to earn, if it is ever earned at all, Most of us live and die without ever experiencing it, either given or received. What made you think of that? I asked. She turned to look at me directly, her 4 eyelids blinking slowly, deliberately. Because what you did today, she said, resembles it more closely than anything I have ever witnessed from someone I have known for less than a week. The words settled between us, heavy and unexpected, and for a moment I did not know how to respond. I thought about the reception hall, about the accusation that had started all of this, about the long, careful conversations that had followed, and I realized that somewhere along the way, without either of us fully noticing it happening, something had shifted between the two of us that neither human nor Threnai custom had a clean, simple name for. I do not know if it is the same thing, I said honestly. I only know that when I saw that drone moving toward you, I did not think about Tessuvain, or bonds, or debts, or rewards. I only thought that I did not want anything to happen to you, and that thought was enough to move my body faster than my mind could keep up with. That is precisely what troubles me, she said, though her voice carried no real trouble in it anymore, only a kind of quiet wonder. Among my people, such devotion requires justification, a reason strong enough to explain the risk. Yours required nothing at all. It simply existed, fully formed, the moment it was needed. Maybe that is the difference between us, I said. You build trust like a structure, carefully, piece by piece, until it can bear weight. We build it more like a reflex, something that exists before we even decide to build it at all. She considered this for a long moment, and then, slowly, something in her posture eased, the rigid formality she always carried softening just slightly, as though some tension she had been holding since the reception hall had finally begun to release. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. I accused you of aggression when you had shown me nothing but a kind of loyalty I did not have the language to recognize. You owe me nothing, I said. You reacted according to everything your culture taught you was true. I would have been surprised if you had reacted any other way. Perhaps, she said, but I am beginning to understand that not every truth I was taught applies equally to every species I encounter. It seems a difficult lesson to have needed a weapon fired at me to finally learn. Most difficult lessons arrive that way, I said. Unfortunately. A faint, genuine smile crossed her face then, the first I had ever seen from her, small and brief, but entirely real, and something about it made the ache in my arm feel a little more bearable. There is a ceremony, she said, after a moment, her tone shifting into something more thoughtful, almost tentative. Among my people, when someone displays devotion of the kind I described, Tessuvain, it is customary to formally acknowledge it, publicly, before witnesses. I have never had occasion to perform such an acknowledgement myself. I did not expect my first opportunity would come from a human. What does the ceremony involve? I asked, curious despite the exhaustion pulling at the edges of my thoughts. I have not yet decided, she said, standing slowly from her chair. But I intend to find out, and I intend to make certain that when it happens, every member of my delegation understands exactly what they are witnessing and why. She paused at the doorway of the medical bay, glancing back at me one final time before she left. Rest, Daniel, she said, using my name again without hesitation this time, as though it had always belonged easily on her tongue. You have earned it. And for the first time since the night of the reception hall, I fell asleep without the weight of her accusation pressing against my chest, replaced instead by something lighter, something that felt, unmistakably, like the beginning of an understanding neither of our peoples had ever quite reached before. 2 weeks passed before the ceremony took place, and in that time, the station itself seemed to shift in ways I had not expected. Word of the incident in the corridor had spread quickly, first through official reports, then through the quieter, more honest channels of gossip that exist on every station regardless of species. By the time the day of the ceremony arrived, nearly everyone, human and Threnai alike, knew some version of what had happened between Calith and me, though few understood the full weight of what it meant to her people. The ceremony was held in the same reception hall where the entire misunderstanding had begun, and I found a strange kind of symmetry in that choice, one I suspected was entirely deliberate on Calith's part. The hall had been transformed for the occasion. Soft blue light, the color Threnai associated with honor and formal recognition, replaced the warm gold tones of the earlier reception. Members of both delegations filled the room, human diplomats standing alongside Threnai officers, and near the front, Director Castellon stood beside Ambassador Threll, both of them watching, with expressions of careful, curious anticipation. I stood near the center of the room, dressed once again in my formal uniform, my arm fully healed, though the memory of the injury remained sharp and clear in my mind. Grace Hollins caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small, encouraging nod, and I found myself grateful for the familiar presence amid a ceremony whose customs I still did not fully understand. Calith entered a few minutes later, and the entire room fell silent instantly, the way it had the very first time she had confronted me weeks earlier, though this silence carried an entirely different weight. She wore formal Threnai attire, deep blue fabric layered in a way that emphasized the segmented ridge along her spine rather than concealing it, and I understood, somehow, that this was significant, a deliberate choice meant to convey something to everyone watching. She walked directly to where I stood, stopping just close enough that I could see the careful composure in her expression, the same rigid formality she had carried since the moment we met, though now it seemed to hold something warmer beneath its surface. "Lieutenant Daniel Ashford," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "Weeks ago, in this very room, I accused you publicly of an act I believe to be aggression. I demand, before these witnesses, the opportunity to correct that accusation." A murmur rippled through the crowd, though it quieted quickly as she continued. "I asked you why you gazed at my back," she said. "You struggled, that night, to answer a question that should never have required an answer at all. I understand now that the failure was not yours. It was mine, for not possessing the language to recognize what I was witnessing." She turned slightly, addressing the room rather than just me, her voice growing stronger, more formal, carrying the weight of ceremony now rather than simple conversation. "Among my people," she said, "there exists a bond called Tessuvain, a devotion so rare that most Threnai never witness it in their lifetime, let alone receive it. It is not built through debt, or rank, or blood. It is offered freely, without calculation, the moment it is needed, regardless of cost to the one offering it." She turned back to face me directly. I did not understand, that first night, that I was witnessing the early signs of exactly this. I mistook devotion for aggression because I lacked the framework to recognize it. Lieutenant Ashford has since proven, through action rather than words alone, that his intentions from that very first night were never anything but honorable. Ambassador Threll stepped forward then, standing beside Calith, his expression solemn and formal. "It is rare," he said, addressing the room, "for a Threnai officer to acknowledge Tessuvain publicly, and rarer still for it to be acknowledged towards someone outside our species entirely. Yet Commander Vren has requested this ceremony specifically because she believes what occurred between herself and Lieutenant Ashford deserves recognition, not concealment." Calith reached toward a small case held by one of her attendants, opening it to reveal a thin, intricately woven cord, deep blue in color, the same shade as her formal attire. "This cord," she said, "is traditionally offered only between bonded Threnai, a physical symbol of the trust formed through Tessuvain. I have never offered it to anyone outside my own people. I do not believe it has ever been offered to a human before." She lifted the cord carefully, holding it out toward me. "I ask you, Daniel Ashford, formally and before witnesses, to accept this not as payment, not as debt, but as acknowledgement. I understand now that you require neither bond nor reward to offer protection freely. I offer this only because I wish, for the first time in my life, to offer something in return, freely, without calculation of my own." I stood there for a long moment, the weight of the room's silence pressing gently against me, and I understood, somehow, that this was not simply a formality. It was Caliph, reaching across an enormous cultural distance, attempting, in the only language her people possessed, to say something that English had never quite needed words for at all. "I accept," I said, "not because I require it, but because I understand what it means for you to offer it." She stepped forward and, with careful, deliberate movements, tied the cord gently around my wrist, her fingers steady despite the obvious significance of the moment. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at me with an expression I had never seen from her before, something that, on a human face, I would have called warmth. "There is one more matter," she said, turning again to address the room. "Since the incident in the corridor, I have spoken with several members of my delegation, as well as members of the human research staff, about this custom you call watching each other's backs. I have learned, to my great surprise, that it is far more common among your people than I ever realized." She gestured toward the crowd, and I noticed, following her gesture, small groups of humans scattered throughout the room, standing in configurations I had never consciously registered before, positioned near doorways, near open spaces, angled subtly to keep sightlines clear, protecting each other without any of them seeming to notice they were doing it at all. "It happens constantly," Caliph continued, quietly, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, in ways your own people rarely even notice about themselves. I confess, I find this both remarkable and, if I am honest, deeply humbling. Ambassador Threll nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps," he said, "there is wisdom in a form of trust that requires no structure to exist. Our systems are strong, but they are also slow, deliberate, sometimes too rigid to respond to sudden need. Perhaps there is value in learning to build trust more quickly when circumstances demand it." "I do not suggest we abandon our customs," Caliph said quickly, "but I do believe we could learn something from them, from this instinct that requires no bond, no debt, no calculation, only the simple choice to care." She turned back to me one final time, and the formal ceremony seemed to soften into something quieter, more personal, despite the audience still watching closely. "I asked you once why you gazed at my back," she said, as though it were an accusation. "I find myself now asking a different question entirely." "What question is that?" I asked. "Would you continue to do so?" she said, "not because I have asked it of you, not because of any bond we have formed today, but simply because it is who you are." I thought of my father, standing quietly near doorways at every gathering I could remember, never explaining why, never needing to. I thought of every small, unspoken act of care I had witnessed throughout my life, passed down without ceremony, without acknowledgement, simply because that was what humans did for one another. "I would," I said, "whether you asked or not." Something in her expression shifted then, settling into an ease I had never seen from her before, and she extended her hand toward me, not in the formal Threnai greeting I had grown accustomed to, but in the simple human gesture I had taught her weeks earlier during one of our long conversations. "Then perhaps," she said, "it is only fair that I offer the same in return." She turned slightly, presenting her side to me rather than her back, a small gesture I recognized instantly as deliberate, symbolic, an invitation rather than a vulnerability. "Gaze at my back if you wish, Daniel," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, her voice carrying none of the accusation it had held weeks earlier, only something warm and steady and entirely new. "And I will gaze at yours." The room erupted into quiet applause, human and Threnai alike, and as I stood there, the woven cord still warm against my wrist, I understood that something far larger than a single misunderstanding had shifted that day. Two cultures, built on entirely different foundations of trust, had found, however briefly, however imperfectly, a shared language neither had possessed before. It had begun with an accusation, sharp and cold, across a crowded reception hall. It ended, weeks later, in that same room, with an offer freely given, freely accepted, and a friendship that neither of us could have predicted the night she first turned to me and asked why I gazed at her back. I never gave her a simple answer to that question. I do not think one exists. But standing there, watching her smile for the second time in the weeks I had known her, I understood, finally, that some things do not need simple answers. They only need time, patience, and the willingness of two very different people to stand, quietly, at each other's backs, for no reason beyond the simple fact that they had chosen to.